My stepmother always mistook my silence for submission, the quiet habit of a freeloader. She had no idea that for the past 7 years, I was never mute. I was counting. I counted every dollar, every lie, and every loophole in the lavish empire she built on my father's bones. Tonight, at her $50 million gala, the final bill will not stop at a few thousand for dinner. It will be the price of a stolen life. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Natalie Thomas, and I am 31 years old. Tonight, I am attending a celebration of my own erasure. The air inside Lumina Prime, downtown Chicago's most fiercely exclusive dining establishment, was suffocatingly heavy. It smelled of white truffles, aged oak, and the sharp metallic tang of ruthless ambition. It was a space meticulously designed to intimidate the uninvited, boasting soaring vaulted ceilings draped in cascading crystal chandeliers. Those chandeliers threw fractured, dazzling light across tables dressed in heavy ivory linen and polished silver. Tonight, the entire main dining floor had been bought out for a dual purpose. It was the 55th birthday of my stepmother, Eleanor Sterling, and it also served as the official launch party for the family's highly anticipated new tech investment fund. The room buzzed with the low, cultivated murmur of venture capitalists, tech executives, and society elites, all eager to orbit the blazing Sterling sun. I approached the center table, a sprawling banquet setup positioned directly beneath the grandest chandelier in the room. Eleanor was holding court, draped in an emerald green silk gown that undoubtedly cost more than the annual salary of the waiter serving her. She was holding a delicate crystal flute of imported vintage champagne, throwing her head back and laughing at a joke made by a prominent senator. When her icy blue eyes finally locked onto me, the practiced smile never left her flawless face, but the temperature in her gaze plummeted to absolute zero. She stepped slightly away from her wealthy guests, moving with the predatory grace of a woman who knew exactly how much power she held in this room. "Natalie," she said, her voice a melodic, sugary purr pitched perfectly so only our immediate circle could hear the venom dripping from the syllables. "Find another table. This one is for family." Right on cue, a quiet, sneering chuckle erupted from my right. It was Trent, my 26-year-old stepbrother, casually adjusting the lapels of his bespoke velvet dinner jacket. Next to him stood Marlo, 24 years old, who did not even bother to look up from the glowing screen of her phone. However, her gloss-still lips immediately curled into a smirk of pure, practiced disdain. They were a perfectly rehearsed choir of cruelty, echoing their mother's symphony of exclusion. I did not argue. I did not flinch, nor did I offer them the satisfaction of a hurt expression. I simply nodded once, turned on my heel, and allowed the nervous maitre d' to usher me away from the glowing epicenter of the party. He led me past the beautiful people and the clinking glasses, finally depositing me at a tiny, wobbly two-seater shoved into a dark corner near the kitchen's swinging doors. It was a terrible spot where the rushing waiters brought sudden gusts of hot air and the harsh clatter of dirty dishes. It was a physical, undeniable manifestation of my exact place in Eleanor's world. I sat down in the dim lighting, folded my hands neatly in my lap, and quietly observed. From my shadowy vantage point, I watched my so-called family soak in the blind adoration of Chicago's elite. I watched them toast to their own brilliance, drinking bottles of wine that cost thousands of dollars, completely oblivious to the storm gathering right beneath their feet. About an hour into the agonizingly opulent evening, a young waiter approached my obscure table. He avoided eye contact, his shoulders tense, as he slid a heavy black leather check presenter onto the polished wood. I did not need to open it to know what it meant, but I flipped the leather cover open anyway. The total printed at the bottom was $4,850. This was Eleanor's favorite psychological weapon. At every gala, every charity dinner, every family milestone I was forced to attend for the sake of public appearances, she arranged for the bill of their lavish indulgences to be brought to my table. It was her way of forcing me to literally pay for my redundant existence, a sick reminder that I was a parasite allowed to breathe their air only if I subsidized their luxury. A genuine icy smile touched the corners of my mouth. I reached into my leather purse, pulled out my heavy metal credit card, and placed it smoothly onto the silver tray without a single moment of hesitation. When the waiter returned with the final slip, I picked up the heavy black pen and deliberately wrote in a 25% tip, bringing the astronomical number even higher. I signed my name with sweeping, confident strokes. I could easily afford it, and more importantly, I knew something they did not. I knew that this petty humiliation was the absolute peak of their power. This was their final night of triumph. As the waiter hurried away with the signed receipt, my mind involuntarily drifted back 19 years. I remembered being 12 years old, standing in a freezing, windswept cemetery in a black dress that felt too tight across my chest. My father, Arthur Thomas, had died suddenly, leaving a void so massive it felt like the earth had swallowed me whole. I remembered Eleanor at the funeral, playing the role of the shattered widow with absolute perfection. She clutched a black lace handkerchief to her dry eyes and sobbed beautifully for the flashing cameras of the local press. Behind closed doors, however, her grief vanished instantly. She gathered my father's lawyers and accountants, loudly proclaiming that he had been a fool, that he had left us drowning in a mountain of insurmountable debt. She looked at 12-year-old me, trembling and entirely alone in the world, and declared that she was humanely taking me in. She told everyone she was saving me from living on the cold streets out of the goodness of her own heart. For almost 2 decades, I believed the narrative. I believed I was the charity case of a generous saint. I believed my father was a miserable failure. But the bill I had just paid was absolutely nothing compared to the monumental debt Eleanor Sterling owed me. My sanctuary was not found in sprawling mansions or high society galas. It existed within the cold, sterile server rooms of Nexus Vault Data Solutions. As a senior copyright and data analyst for the independent private firm, my entire life revolved around deep technology auditing. We were the digital archaeologists hired by global corporations to excavate buried intellectual property, unravel impossibly complex licensing disputes, and verify billions of lines of code. In my world, data was the only absolute truth. It did not manipulate, it did not play the grieving widow, and it certainly did not lie. It just sat there in the dark, waiting patiently for someone smart enough to decipher it. Exactly 6 months ago, I was assigned a spectacularly tedious archiving project. A massive healthcare conglomerate had hired Nexus Vault to digitize and audit a vast warehouse of supposedly obsolete medical technology records dating back to the late 1990s. It was grueling, mind-numbing work. I spent countless nights scrolling through endless digitized files of outdated patent applications and rejected schematic designs. Then, on a rainy Tuesday night at 2 o'clock in the morning, the harsh blue light of my monitor illuminated a highly complex mechanical blueprint for a biometric microchip. The design was elegant, revolutionary for its time, and entirely familiar. I zoomed in on the bottom right corner of the scanned parchment. There, written in the sharp, slanted handwriting I used to trace with my tiny fingers as a child, was a signature. Arthur Thomas, my father. My breath completely stopped. I quickly pulled up the official federal patent registry. Eleanor had spent 19 long years swearing to anyone who would listen that my father died a delusional failure, leaving behind nothing but useless scribbles and catastrophic debt. Yet the registry on my screen showed this exact microchip design was not abandoned at all. It was intensely active. More than active, It was the foundational architecture for three of the world's most profitable portable cardiac monitors, currently used in hospitals across the globe. But the patent did not belong to Arthur Thomas anymore. It had been quietly transferred, mere days after his funeral, to a faceless corporate shell company named Apex Dynamics. For the next 3 weeks, I barely slept for more than 2 hours a night. I deliberately abused my high-level security clearance at Nexus Vault, weaponizing our proprietary financial tracking algorithms to hunt down the true owners of Apex Dynamics. I built an untraceable ghost network on my secure terminal, feeding the program scraps of corporate tax returns, redacted offshore banking fragments, and global medical licensing payouts. The algorithms aggressively chewed through the encrypted data, tracing a river of hidden wealth that was absolutely staggering in its sheer volume. Apex Dynamics was generating tens of millions of dollars annually in licensing fees alone. I ruthlessly followed the money. I broke through 3 layers of corporate shielding in the Cayman Islands, bypassed a dummy corporation registered in Delaware, and finally slammed into the ultimate beneficiary. Apex Dynamics was wholly owned by a private blind trust. The sole, undisputed trustee of that account was Eleanor Sterling. The revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The money that paid for the sprawling 7-bedroom ski chalet in Aspen, the fleet of custom Italian sports cars Trent wrecked and replaced with zero consequences, the millions of dollars poured into Marlowe's disastrous chain of high-end fashion boutiques that went completely bankrupt within 18 months, all of it came out of my father's brain. They were wearing his genius like cheap jewelry. They were driving his legacy into the ground. They were drinking imported champagne bought with his stolen life. The mountain of debt Eleanor claimed she miraculously saved me from was a massive, carefully fabricated illusion designed to keep me compliant, silent, and falsely grateful while she actively looted the family vault. However, I knew that in a court of law, I needed more than just digital footprints to destroy a woman with Eleanor's unlimited resources. I needed human testimony. I needed the man who had actually been in the laboratory when those blueprints were drawn. I immediately began searching for Julian Hayes. Julian was my father's former business partner and co-engineer, a brilliant but deeply eccentric man who had completely vanished from the technology industry shortly after my father passed away. Eleanor had smoothly told everyone he suffered a severe nervous breakdown and moved away to seek institutional help. Using a complex combination of public property tax records and obscure utility bills, I tracked his name to a dilapidated, off-grid cabin in the dense, freezing woods of northern Michigan, 300 miles away from Chicago. When I knocked on his heavy oak door 2 weeks later, the man who answered was a frail ghost of the energetic uncle figure I remembered from my youth. Julian was thin. His hair was stark white, and his eyes were heavily guarded and weary. He tried to slam the door shut the moment I stated my full name, but I quickly wedged my heavy leather boot in the doorframe. "I found the biometric microchip blueprints, Julian," I said, my voice steady against the howling wind. "I know everything about Apex Dynamics. I know Eleanor stole it all." He froze, his weathered, scarred hand trembling violently on the brass doorknob. For one long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the wind ripping through the towering pine trees. Finally, he let out a harsh, bitter sigh, his shoulders sagging in defeat. He pulled the door open, silently motioning for me to step inside the dimly lit, freezing cabin. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of books, tangled wires, and dusty electronic components. "She did not just steal it, Natalie," Julian whispered, his voice raspy from years of disuse as he poured 2 mugs of black coffee with shaking hands. "She orchestrated a complete corporate slaughter. She locked me out of our own laboratory. She forged Arthur's signature on the intellectual property transfer documents while he was heavily sedated on painkillers in the intensive care unit. When I found out and threatened to expose her, She promised to destroy my family with a legion of corporate lawyers and frame me for embezzlement. She stripped me of my shares, took my life's work, and threw me to the wolves. I looked at the broken, exhausted man sitting across from me, finally realizing the sheer, terrifying magnitude of Eleanor's cruelty. She had not just ruined my childhood, she had obliterated absolutely anyone who stood between her and my father's wealth. "I am not here to just talk about the past, Julian," I told him, wrapping my cold hands tightly around the warm ceramic mug. "I am going to take it all back, every single cent, and I am going to burn her empire to the absolute ground while everyone she desperately cares about watches. But I need your help to strike the match." Julian stared down into his dark coffee for a very long time. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy with decades of unsaid grief. Then, he slowly raised his head. For the first time in nearly 20 years, a dangerous, razor-sharp light of pure vengeance sparked in his weary eyes. "Tell me your plan," he said. Julian stood up from his armchair, his knees popping in the freezing cabin air. He walked over to a corner of the room, pulled back a faded wool rug, and pried up a loose wooden floorboard. From the dark cavity beneath, he retrieved a heavy fireproof steel lockbox. He dropped it onto the table between us. Inside were not just memories, but undeniable, mathematical proof of a felony. He handed me a stack of raw printed server logs containing the original undeleted email chains between Eleanor and a corrupt notary public. Then, he placed a small vintage microcassette recorder next to my coffee mug. "I left it running in the room," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, "the day she brought the transfer papers to the intensive care unit." I pressed play. The crackling audio filled the quiet cabin. I heard the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of my father's ventilator. Then, Eleanor's voice, cold and sharp as a scalpel, instructing the lawyer on exactly where to guide my father's limp hand to forge the signature. I heard my father groan, entirely incoherent, heavily sedated on maximum doses of morphine. It was the exact moment my future was murdered. My chest tightened until it physically ached, but I forced every ounce of grief down into a tight, dark box inside my mind. Emotion was a vulnerability. Cold, hard logic was my weapon. I ejected the tape and dropped it into my leather bag. It was the final piece of the equation. Back in Chicago, Julian and I did not go to the police. Standard law enforcement would be utterly useless against a woman with a billionaire's network. Instead, we quietly secured the services of a boutique, hyper-aggressive law firm located high up in a downtown skyscraper. They were a team of ruthless attorneys who specialized exclusively in white-collar financial crimes and corporate asset recovery. I drained my entire life savings, writing a cashier's check for a retainer of $250,000. It was a massive sum, but I viewed it as an investment with a guaranteed, devastating return. For 2 solid months, our legal team operated in absolute secrecy. We constructed an airtight, weaponized dossier. Every single dollar stolen from my father's estate was mapped out on massive whiteboards, tracked through a labyrinth of shell companies, and mathematically proven to be the foundational capital of Apex Dynamics. But as we dug deeper into Eleanor's current financial architecture, we discovered a fatal structural weakness, a massive vulnerability she was desperately trying to hide behind her designer clothes and charity galas. Eleanor was entirely over-leveraged. Trent, possessing absolutely no genuine business acumen, was attempting to launch a revolutionary data storage startup. The platform was essentially vaporware, practically worthless in a competitive market. But Trent had convinced his mother it was the next big tech unicorn. To fund this delusion, Eleanor was actively courting a syndicate of aggressive venture capitalists, attempting to raise a Series A funding round of exactly $50 million. Because Trent's company had zero actual value, Eleanor had done something incredibly reckless to guarantee the massive investment. She had legally pledged the entire intellectual property portfolio of Apex Dynamics as collateral. She was using my father's stolen patents to underwrite her son's catastrophic vanity project. Sitting in the sleek glass conference room of our law firm, the lead attorney, a sharp woman in a tailored navy suit, laid out the harsh reality of our legal options. If we file a standard civil lawsuit today, she explained, tapping her silver pen on the polished mahogany table, Eleanor will immediately countersue. She will tie you up in endless discovery motions for 10 to 15 years. She will hire 5 different defense firms to exhaust your financial resources, and the moment the judge looks the other way, she will liquidate Apex Dynamics and funnel the capital into untraceable offshore accounts in jurisdictions without extradition treaties. You will eventually win a piece of paper, but you will never see a single dime. I looked at the meticulously organized binders of evidence stacked heavily on the table. A quiet, drawn-out legal battle in a sterile courtroom was exactly what Eleanor would expect. It was comfortable. It was private. I absolutely refused to grant her the luxury of a private defeat. "We are not going to civil court," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of hesitation. "We are going to let her sign the venture capital agreement. We are going to let her legally commit wire fraud and securities fraud by pledging assets she does not own to interstate investors. And then, we are going to publicly execute her reputation at the exact moment she believes she is untouchable." The attorney stopped tapping her pen. A slow, deeply impressed smile spread across her face. She immediately picked up her encrypted phone and reached out to a highly trusted contact, a senior special investigator for the Securities and Exchange Commission. When the federal investigator reviewed our irrefutable evidence, the forged signatures, the hidden audio tape, and the complex money laundering trails, he did not just open a standard inquiry file. He immediately brought in the criminal division of the Department of Justice. For the next 30 days, a joint federal task force quietly observed Eleanor's every move, entirely invisible to her highly paid private security detail. We perfectly synchronized our legal strike with the exact date of her 55th birthday gala at Lumina Prime. The trap was meticulously set, the mathematical calculations were completely flawless, and the countdown to her absolute destruction had officially begun. If you want to witness exactly how this trap snaps shut, be sure to subscribe to Revenge Stories so you do not miss the next explosive chapter of this journey. The heavy mahogany grandfather clock in the grand foyer of Lumina Prime struck 9, signaling the transition from the agonizingly long cocktail hour to the main spectacle of the evening. The gentle hum of a string quartet gracefully faded into silence. A focused spotlight pierced through the warm, ambient glow of the restaurant, illuminating a polished acrylic podium set exactly in the center of the room. The clinking of heavy silver forks against fine china ceased entirely. Eleanor Sterling glided toward the stage, her emerald silk gown trailing behind her like the tail of a venomous, majestic serpent. She moved with an expertly calculated humility, pausing exactly twice to place a manicured hand over her heart in response to the scattered, adoring applause. When she reached the microphone, she adjusted it with a delicate touch. The lighting caught the massive diamond resting perfectly at her throat, a dazzling rock bought and paid for by stolen brilliance. "My dearest friends, esteemed colleagues, and beloved family," Eleanor began, her voice a masterclass in theatrical emotion. It was pitched perfectly, carrying a slight, entirely fabricated tremor of gratitude. "Standing before you tonight, on my 55th birthday, I am profoundly overwhelmed. Looking around this magnificent room, I do not just see the titans of Chicago's financial sector. I see the incredible village that helped a terrified, widowed mother rebuild a shattered life." She paused, expertly letting the silence hang in the air so the audience could fully absorb her imaginary pain. 19 years ago, my world was entirely destroyed," she continued, her voice dipping into a hushed, sorrowful register. "My late husband, Arthur, left this earth far too soon, and he left behind a nightmare. We were drowning in a suffocating ocean of corporate debt, abandoned contracts, and broken promises. I was completely alone, staring down the barrel of absolute financial ruin. But I looked at my two beautiful, innocent babies, Trent and Marlowe. She gestured gracefully toward the front table. Trent adjusted his posture, looking deeply serious and mature, while Marlowe practically deserved an Academy Award as she dabbed the corner of her perfectly dry eye with a lace napkin. And, Eleanor said, taking a deep, dramatic breath, I looked at Arthur's daughter from a previous marriage, a poor, orphaned 12-year-old girl who had absolutely nowhere else to go. I knew in that very moment that surrender was simply not an option. I took her in as my own. I swore I would build a fortress around our family, working 80 hours a week, sacrificing my own youth, turning pennies into dollars through sheer, unrelenting willpower. I built Apex Dynamics from the ashes of failure, so my children, all of my children, would never know the bitter taste of poverty. The sheer audacity of her lies was physically nauseating. I sat perfectly still in the dark, drafty corner of the restaurant, taking a slow sip of my complimentary tap water. I dragged my gaze across the crowded room, memorizing every single face that was currently eating out of the palm of her hand. The wealthy venture capitalists, the corrupt politicians, the society wives. They were nodding solemnly, murmuring words of profound respect. They absolutely loved this narrative. The elite class always adored a highly sanitized story of struggle, especially when it validated their own ruthless pursuit of wealth. They clapped enthusiastically, a thunderous wave of applause washing over the dining room to celebrate a woman who was, in reality, nothing more than a highly successful parasite. As the applause naturally died down, the most anticipated moment of the evening arrived. Richard Vance, the billionaire founder of a massive Silicon Valley investment syndicate and the lead angel investor for tonight's venture, confidently stepped up to the podium to join Eleanor. He was a tall, silver-haired man with the arrogant swagger of someone who believed his wealth made him a minor deity. Eleanor, your resilience is a profound inspiration to every single person in this room. Richard boomed into the microphone, wrapping a heavy arm around her shoulders. And the apple clearly does not fall far from the tree. Your son, Trent, has pitched us a revolutionary vision for the future of decentralized data storage. It is bold, it is aggressive, and it is exactly the kind of innovation my firm wants to stand behind. Richard picked up a sleek, gold-plated fountain pen from the podium. He held it up so the room could see it glint under the crystal chandeliers. Therefore, it is my absolute honor to officially announce that our syndicate is committing exactly $50 million to fund this incredible new tech startup, fully secured and underwritten by the proven, ironclad assets of Apex Dynamics. The dining room erupted into wild cheers and standing ovations. Waiters immediately rushed forward, carrying silver trays loaded with fresh glasses of vintage champagne to toast the historic $50 million deal. The heavy leather portfolios containing the binding legal contracts were slid onto the acrylic podium. Richard uncapped his gold pen, smiling brightly for the hired photographers who were rapidly snapping pictures. From the shadows of my forgotten table near the swinging kitchen doors, I gently set my water glass down on the wobbly wood. The time for silent observation was officially over. I slowly stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my simple black dress. I reached down and picked up my heavy black leather briefcase. Inside, nestled securely, were 6 identical sets of legal documents. They were beautifully organized, sharply printed, and carefully bound with bright red spines. The trap had been meticulously set. The bait was taken. Now it was time to tear the theater down to its very foundations. Richard Vance held his gold-plated fountain pen poised mere inches above the thick cream-colored paper of the investment contract. The hired event photographers were aggressively snapping pictures, bathing the stage in rapid, blinding flashes of white light. The entire room held its collective breath, eagerly waiting for the ink to flow and officially seal the $50 million syndicate deal. Wait just 1 minute, a voice thundered from the back of the dining room. The voice was rough, deeply hoarse from years of disuse, yet it carried the absolute crushing weight of a falling mountain. It sliced right through the refined atmosphere of the restaurant, instantly freezing every single smile and silencing every polite murmur. The sharp clinking of heavy silver forks against fine china ceased entirely. Richard Vance halted his hand in midair, frowning in deep annoyance at the sudden interruption. The heavy double oak doors at the main entrance had been shoved wide open. Julian Hayes stood firmly in the doorway. He was no longer the frail, exhausted hermit hiding in a freezing cabin in the woods. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, projecting an aura of righteous, undeniable fury. Flanking him on either side were 4 highly aggressive corporate attorneys, all wearing immaculate, sharply tailored gray suits and carrying thick leather briefcases. They moved with the synchronized, predatory coordination of a legal firing squad. On the center stage, the magnificent illusion Eleanor had spent 19 years building began to violently fracture. The flawless, manufactured warmth instantly drained from her face, leaving behind a pale, terrified mask. The vintage crystal champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the polished marble floor and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. She gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium so tightly that her manicured knuckles turned completely white under the bright stage lights. That was my cue. I finally stood up from the wobbly table in the dark, drafty corner by the swinging kitchen doors. I stepped out of the shadowy obscurity and into the brilliant, unforgiving light of the main floor. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate, and terrifying cadence of a highly calculated execution. The sea of wealthy venture capitalists, corrupt politicians, and society wives instinctively parted to make way for me, their confused whispers rising into the air like an approaching swarm of angry locusts. I kept my gaze locked straight ahead, completely ignoring Eleanor's wildly darting, panicked eyes. I walked up the short, carpeted steps of the center stage, my black heels clicking sharply against the wood. I stopped directly in front of Richard Vance. Without a single word, I lifted my heavy black leather briefcase and popped the brass locks open with a sharp, echoing snap. I reached inside and pulled out a massive, meticulously organized legal dossier, tightly bound with a bright red spine. I slammed it down onto the acrylic podium, dropping it squarely on top of the $50 million investment agreement he was about to sign. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the dead, silent dining room. It was terrifyingly steady, completely devoid of the hysterical anger or bitter sorrow they would have expected from a scorned stepchild. "Before you sign that binding document and legally commit $50 million of your client's money, I highly suggest you review page 4 of this file. You are about to become the primary financial accessory to massive interstate federal fraud." Richard Vance stared at me, his arrogant billionaire swagger entirely evaporating, quickly replaced by deep confusion and rapidly growing alarm. He instinctively took a cautious step backward, pulling his hand away from the contract as if the paper itself had suddenly caught fire. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice tight with sudden anxiety. "My name is Natalie Thomas," I replied evenly, turning my head slowly to lock eyes with the pale, trembling woman standing beside him. "I am the biological daughter of Arthur Thomas, the brilliant engineer whose stolen genius built every single thing in this room." I turned my back on Eleanor and faced the massive crowd of elite investors. "The collateral you are heavily investing in tonight, the entire intellectual property portfolio of Apex Dynamics, is stolen property. Every single medical patent, every microchip design, and every lucrative licensing agreement was illegally transferred via heavily forged documents. Those documents were signed while my father was unconscious and dying on his deathbed. Eleanor Sterling does not own Apex Dynamics. She never did. Legally pledging it as corporate collateral today is a severe, undeniable violation of federal intellectual property laws. A collective, horrified gasp violently rippled through the dining room. The atmosphere instantly turned toxic. The smell of expensive perfume could no longer mask the sudden, overwhelming stench of financial panic. Several major investors immediately jumped up from their tables, aggressively dialing their crisis management teams on their phones. The lead attorney in the sharp gray suit stepped forward from the back of the room, standing right beside Julian. She opened her own copy of the red-bound dossier, adjusted her glasses, and aggressively raised her voice, letting the cold, hard mathematics of Eleanor's lifelong crimes wash over the terrified crowd. "We have successfully tracked every single stolen asset," the lawyer announced with ruthless clarity. "We have undeniable, mathematical proof of $4.2 million illegally transferred directly into a private, offshore bank account located in the Cayman Islands. We have thoroughly documented evidence of exactly $850,000 siphoned away to purchase custom Italian supercars and quietly pay off underground gambling debts for her son, Trent Sterling. We have tracked $3.5 million recklessly poured into completely bankrupt retail ventures. Every single cent was violently extracted from the intellectual legacy of Arthur Thomas. Furthermore, we possess the original, undeleted server logs, the corrupt notary stamps, and the actual audio recordings of the exact moment the theft occurred 19 years ago. Every single number she spoke acted as another nail violently driven into the coffin of the Sterling Empire. The aristocratic, sophisticated mask was entirely ripped away, exposing them as nothing more than cheap, desperate thieves playing dress-up with a dead man's money. At the front table, Trent's face flushed a violent, dark purple. The carefully rehearsed facade of the polished, visionary technology founder vanished entirely, rapidly replaced by the cornered, rabid animal he truly was beneath the expensive clothes. "You crazy liar!" Trent screamed at the absolute top of his lungs, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He aggressively kicked a heavy wooden chair out of his way, knocking over a tall crystal vase that shattered loudly. He lunged across the stage, pulling his arm back, fully intending to violently assault me in front of hundreds of witnesses. I did not even blink. I did not take a single step backward to defend myself. Before Trent could even cross half the distance of the stage, 3 massive men wearing dark, inconspicuous suits materialized from the shadows near the kitchen. They were the restaurant's elite private security team, the very same men I had quietly paid $10,000 in cash earlier this week to guarantee my absolute safety tonight. They intercepted Trent with brutal military efficiency. They tackled him hard, slamming him face first into the polished hardwood floor. He thrashed wildly, screaming and cursing as his expensive velvet jacket tore at the shoulder seam. He was completely publicly humiliated as a heavy knee was driven firmly between his shoulder blades, pinning him helplessly to the ground. Absolute, uncontrollable chaos erupted across the luxurious dining room. The musicians had completely abandoned their instruments and fled. Waiters were dropping silver trays in the confusion, sending roasted quail and caviar tumbling across the expensive rugs. Marlo was aggressively hyperventilating at the front table, tears ruining her perfect makeup, desperately hiding her face behind her designer leather purse to escape the flashing cameras of the hired photographers. The photographers had suddenly realized they were no longer shooting a boring corporate launch, but rather documenting the most explosive financial scandal of the decade. Eleanor stood frozen behind the clear acrylic podium, her mouth opening and closing silently. Her $50 million lifeline was gone. Her flawless reputation was entirely annihilated. The magnificent birthday gala she had so meticulously planned had rapidly transformed into a spectacular, unforgettable public slaughter. Despite the catastrophic collapse happening all around her, Eleanor desperately attempted to salvage the shattered pieces of her kingdom. She gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium, took a sharp, jagged breath, and forced a stiff, agonizingly plastic smile onto her pale face. She looked directly at Richard Vance and the panicked crowd of elite investors, raising her hands in a placating gesture. "Please, everyone, I implore you to remain completely calm, Eleanor announced, her voice shaking slightly but desperately clinging to its practiced, aristocratic melody. This is absolutely nothing more than a highly unfortunate, deeply misunderstood family civil dispute. My stepdaughter has always been terribly confused and bitterly resentful regarding her father's passing. This is a private tantrum, nothing more. My legal team will clear up this ridiculous misunderstanding first thing in the morning. I let out a low, dark chuckle that cut cleanly through the murmurs of the crowd. A cold smirk crossed my face. A civil dispute? I asked, slowly shaking my head. You really have no idea what is happening right now, do you? I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers loudly. At my explicit signal, the heavy brass doors at the rear of the dining room forcefully swung open. 4 tall men and 2 women wearing unassuming dark windbreakers stepped forward into the luxurious dining room. They did not carry legal briefcases. They wore heavy tactical belts, and as they simultaneously raised their hands, the bright crystal chandeliers reflected blindingly off their solid gold shields. They were special agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like crushed gravel, marched straight up the carpeted steps to the center stage. "Eleanor Sterling and Trent Sterling," the agent boomed, his voice entirely silencing the room. "We are executing an immediate, on-site federal arrest warrant. You are both being taken into federal custody under multiple felony charges of massive interstate bank fraud, wire fraud, and severe securities violations." Eleanor physically recoiled, gasping for air as if the agent had struck her. The agent coldly explained the reality of her fatal miscalculation. She had not simply stolen assets from a vulnerable family member in a local jurisdiction. By actively using those stolen, highly lucrative patents to maliciously solicit $50 million across state lines tonight, she had committed a monumental federal crime. Furthermore, a permanent, global freeze had already been authorized and placed on every single bank account, blind trust fund, and offshore shell company attached to the Sterling name. Her empire was instantly reduced to zero. The terrifying words, "federal wire fraud" and "global asset freeze" acted as the ultimate poison to the elite class. Richard Vance did not even hesitate for a fraction of a second. He aggressively grabbed the $50 million investment contract he had been about to sign, ripped it straight down the middle, and threw the heavy, ruined parchment onto the floor. He turned and practically sprinted toward the main exit. The rest of the wealthy venture capitalists and society elites followed instantly. It was a humiliating stampede of expensive tailored suits and silk designer dresses, everyone violently pushing and shoving to escape the toxic blast radius of a federal indictment. They abandoned Eleanor entirely, leaving her standing utterly alone on the stage, screaming uncontrollably as the federal agents forcefully grabbed her arms and pulled them tightly behind her back. The sharp, cold click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the rapidly emptying restaurant was the single most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. As the federal agents dragged Eleanor down the short stage steps, her wild, mascara-stained eyes searched the room until they finally locked onto me. The arrogant, untouchable queen was entirely dead. In her place was a terrified, pathetic woman facing absolute ruin. She desperately tried to channel a soft, pleading tone, attempting to use the very last weapon she had left in her arsenal. "Natalie, please," Eleanor begged, her voice cracking with hysterical, ugly tears. "I am your mother. I raised you. We are family. You absolutely cannot do this to me." I slowly walked down the stage steps and stopped right in front of her. I looked directly into her panicked, weeping eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, cleansing ice in my veins. "Find another prison," I replied, my voice echoing coldly in the hollow room. "This one is for family." I stepped casually aside, allowing the federal agents to drag her out of the luxurious restaurant and into the freezing, unforgiving Chicago night. 3 months later, the towering Sterling empire had completely collapsed into a pile of worthless ash. With the global asset freeze firmly in place, their luxurious facade shattered overnight. Marlowe, completely cut off from her stolen wealth, was violently evicted from her sprawling penthouse. She was last seen aggressively selling off her massive collection of vintage designer handbags just to make the monthly rent on a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. Trent was entirely denied bail and was currently sitting in a cold federal holding cell, facing a guaranteed sentence of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. As for me, the federal court swiftly returned full, undisputed control of Apex Dynamics to its rightful owner. But I did not care about the millions of dollars currently sitting safely in the company accounts. I stood alone in the center of a newly restored, state-of-the-art engineering laboratory. The room smelled of fresh soldering iron and clean metal. I walked over to the main drafting table and gently placed my hand flat against the framed original parchment of the biometric microchip blueprint. My fingers slowly traced the sharp, slanted signature of Arthur Thomas. The grueling 7-year war I waged was never about acquiring massive wealth or securing a luxurious lifestyle. It was about ripping the truth out of the dark. It was about putting my late father exactly back where he belonged. He was a brilliant, world-changing pioneer, and the entire world finally knew his name. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.